Hey there, welcome back to another video. My name is Megan and I'm a professional writer and editor and a published author. A viewer commented on a previous video of mine asking for guidance writing the first chapter of a novel, so that's what I'm focusing on today. As a reminder, it is not my intention to coach you. I'm not a coach. Rather, I'm simply going to share a few things that I do to write an engaging first chapter. The first act in general, I'm usually pretty confident about, so hopefully you'll pick up a thing or two to try out with your own novel. Okay, so one of my non-negotiables when I am writing the first chapter of any novel is I always start with action. In my previous manuscript, Chasing Ghosts, which is complete and I'm currently querying it, the first chapter is a car accident that happened about 20 years in the past. It's very high energy, very fast paced. In my current work in progress, which I still don't have a title for it, but it's a romantasy. The first chapter is my female protagonist and one of the main male characters, and they're in the training wing of the castle they live in. It's like a gym. And they're fighting with daggers and swords and bow staffs, and they're also doing hand-to-hand combat. The reason I'm so careful to do this is because I learned the hard way. At a writing conference many years ago, which I actually talk about more in this video, someone read aloud the first maybe 2 pages of a previous manuscript to a panel of literary agents. Okay, this was part of the event, and the guy reading it, he was the organizer of the event, and he told the agents, as soon as the writing loses you, raise your hand. He got through maybe the first 2 paragraphs of my first chapter and all of the agents' hands shot up. And they all had the same reason. Nothing was happening. There was no action. I was just talking and info dumping and going on and on and on. Now, I always lead with action, and in general, I don't let more than a few paragraphs go by without the character taking some sort of action. I follow that rule throughout most of the book, but I'm very clear on it in the first chapter. Now, to be clear, action doesn't have to be earth-shattering or catastrophic, okay? It doesn't have to be a car accident, for instance. Action simply means that the character who is the focal point of that scene or chapter is actively doing something in order to accomplish something, whether it's big or small. The second rule I follow is I will only introduce max, maybe a few characters, and one setting. In other words, I don't info dump, and I don't include too much detail because one of my goals is to help the reader, I guess, get to know the character in that chapter, which in the case of my current work in progress, my romantasy, it's the protagonist. This is their introduction to that person. It's not about feeding them tons of information. And then again, in addition to her, she has her male best friend who she's training with. And then the other best friend, who's a woman, makes a very brief appearance. She has a few lines of dialogue and then she leaves, and that's it. So 95% of the action and dialogue is between 2 people, the protagonist and this very important male supporting character. Similarly, there is usually only one setting in my first chapter, which means that it's typically one scene. There's no setting change. Again, I learned this one the hard way. In fact, it was only recently that I finally understood that you don't have to explain everything in the moment so that the reader always has 100% of the information they need. I might mention something in the first chapter and the reader will go, I wonder what that's about, but I don't explain it until later. Now, as long as it's not something huge or distracting that takes them out of the chapter, it's okay to leave some explanations for later. That's what keeps them reading. I want my reader to be able to focus on just a few things, a few characters, so that right off the bat, they can really immerse themselves in the story and start to see themselves in it. That way, rather than being an observer, they're more of an active participant. As a reader, I can tell you that when the beginning of a book is packed with a ton of information, like the author was definitely just racing to get it all out, it really slows everything down and takes me out of the story. So that's why I try not to overwhelm the reader with too many details right off the bat. My third rule kind of goes along with the previous one, but in my brain, these are still 2 separate things that I consider. After writing the first chapter, I go back and I ask myself, okay, what does the reader learn here? And there are a few reasons that I do this. The first reason is what I said a moment ago. I want to make sure I'm not trying to tell them too many things at once. The second reason is that by identifying what I teach the reader, I can ensure that I'm mentioning things that introduce conflict to help set the stage. There should be conflict in every scene. This is kind of hard for me to explain, so let me just give you an example. In my first chapter of my romantasy, again, these two characters are in the training wing fighting. There are a few things I purposely introduced. We learn that the protagonist has some sort of health issue because she starts to get dizzy and she blacks out a little bit. We learn that the protagonist is human and not a magical race, which is a huge part of her whole character arc and transformation. And lastly, we learn that in the training wing, they no longer have access to running water. There are a few other things that the reader learns, but I very purposely included these three bigger things because they're very important to the plot and the protagonist, and they will keep coming up over and over again. They're a big part of her internal struggle and motivation. At this point, because I've written several books, I do this automatically as I write the first chapter of a novel, but you could plan it in advance. You could say, okay, what are the biggest internal or external battles this character will fight in this story? What are their biggest struggles? Pick one or a few and hint at them. Don't info dump. Just introduce them and set the stage. You are planting the seed. I don't point blank say what her chronic condition is. We don't know why they don't have water. We don't know why it matters that she's human and not magical. But that's a good thing in this case. My fourth rule of thumb, I end on a cliffhanger, even a baby cliffhanger. Again, it doesn't have to be catastrophic to be impactful. The cliffhanger in my first chapter is that we learn they don't have water, but we don't know why. The chapter ends with this exchange between the two characters where the protagonist is like, there's no water coming out of this faucet. And her friend is like half paying attention, so he kind of dismissively, he's like, what do you mean? So she turns to him and she goes, I mean, we have no water. You kind of need water to live. And again, like I said a moment ago, I dropped this kernel of information not just to end with a little cliffhanger, but also because this introduces very important conflict that is threaded throughout most of the story. I aim to end every chapter on a cliffhanger, and to be even more clear, hopefully, when I say cliffhanger, I mean something that makes the reader go, oh, what's that about? I want to know, and then they keep reading. So that's why I say it doesn't have to be earth-shattering to be a cliffhanger. Some authors might disagree with this line of thinking. This is just what works for me. All right, my fifth rule, and there's a caveat to this, so bear with me. I don't make the first chapter too long. First, what the hell is too long? How do we measure that? Well, we don't. We can't. The first chapter of my romantasy is about 1900 words. For all I know, that could seem stupid short to you compared to your first chapter. So how do we define too long? This is something I'm always keeping in mind, but I'm a real stickler about it for the first chapter. If I don't absolutely have to tell the reader something, I don't. Maybe I'll tell them later, or maybe it's not important enough to tell them at all. But there are a couple of reasons I do this. First, it helps me keep the pace fast to get them hooked. Second, it makes it easier, I feel like, for them to get emotionally invested without getting bogged down in too much detail. And third, this is hard to explain, so let's try it this way. You know that feeling of satisfaction you get when you cross something off a list, like a to-do list? I feel like as readers, we get a hint of satisfaction, maybe like a little dopamine boost, when we finish a chapter. I think that's one of the reasons why most of us hate stopping reading in the middle of a chapter. We will always be like, all right, let me just finish this one. It's like a little win on a psychological level. I'm speaking purely of how I think our brains work. I try to mimic that with my first chapter. I want it to be smooth and quick, both in pace and length, to start them off on a satisfying note. Another reason I kind of feel like chapter 1 should be on the shorter or more concise side is that if you stick to making it more action-packed, like I talked about earlier, I know there are exceptions to this, but I feel like action can only go on for so long before the reader really needs a break, because otherwise they kind of become desensitized to the action and sort of just want it to end. It's exhausting. Think of it like this. This is an unrelated example. At work, at my 9 to 5, and every job I've held, anytime something would come my way, like an assignment, I would treat it as urgent. It has to be done now. So to me, all of my work was urgent. If everything is urgent, then nothing is urgent, by definition. You've got to have the yin and the yang. Good can't exist without evil. Light can't exist without dark. Something can only exist in opposition to its counterpart. So if your first chapter is like 50 pages of just nonstop action, then it's like none of it is action, or none of it is impactful action. Maybe that's a better way to say it. Once again, these are my rules for myself that have helped me a lot. It's my own personal process. And while I struggle with other parts of writing a novel, like Act 2, which I talk about in this video, the first chapter and much of Act 1 come naturally to me at this point. And when I'm writing the beginning of a novel, I'm usually like, hell yeah, I'm so brilliant. And it's largely because I follow the tips that I've shared here. I have been told by readers and agents and editors that my writing starts off really strong and then it slows down. So I have had outside confirmation that I know how to start a really good story, and then it nosedives after that, which is why I will never tell you how to write Act 2, because I'm still figuring that out myself. Anyway, thank you to the viewer who requested this topic. I love getting ideas and feedback from you guys. I hope this was helpful. As always, drop me a comment and let me know what you think. If you have any rules that you'd like to share with the class, chime in and let's hear them. I've learned so much from the viewers chatting in the comment section and just sharing their own insight. The community here has been great. Love ya. See you next time.